On a June morning in 1840, the people of Holbeck looked up and saw Egypt. 18 stone columns, a cornice carved in the ancient style, a chimney rising like an obelisk above the rooftops of Leeds. And on the roof, grass. And on the grass, sheep grazing in silence above the noise of 10,000 spindles turning below. Inside, 2,000 men and women fed flax into machines that never rested. The air was warm, deliberately so. The humidity was engineered. Even the light, falling through 65 skylights, had been calculated. Nothing here happened by accident. Everything had been designed, commissioned, and controlled by one man who believed that the greatest civilization the world had ever produced was built on linen. He was not wrong about the linen. 46 years later, the gates closed for the last time. The company crossed the Atlantic and did not return. In 2017, the building was put up for auction. The starting price was £1 sterling. The temple was still standing. The empire that built it was gone. What then does a building remember when no one is left to tell it what it was? In 1701, a young linen merchant from Leeds set up a small mill on Water Lane beside a sluggish stretch of canal in the industrial district of Holbeck. The machinery was modest, the workforce was small, the ambitions were not. John Marshall had chosen his trade wisely. Flax, the plant from which linen is spun, was one of Britain's most prized industrial commodities, used for sailcloth, rope, fine thread, and the shirts of respectable men. But flax was also notoriously difficult to process. The fibers were brittle. They snapped under tension. They required moisture and precision in equal measure, and the mills of the early 19th century were unforgiving environments for both. Dozens of competitors tried and failed. Marshall watched them carefully and waited. His moment came in 1829 with the adoption of wet spinning, a process in which flax fibers were drawn through warm water before being twisted into thread, preventing the breakages that had crippled the industry for decades. The transition was not swift. It took 5 years to convert his operation entirely. But by the early 1830s, Marshall's mills were producing linen on a scale that had no precedent in England. The profits were extraordinary. The orders did not stop. It was during these years of expansion that Marshall began to think not merely about production, but about legacy. He was by this point a man of considerable standing in Leeds, a justice of the peace, a member of Parliament, a founding patron of the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society. It was through the society that he encountered one of the defining intellectual obsessions of his age. In 1823, the society had acquired the mummy of an Egyptian priest named Nesyamun, unwrapped him before an audience of paying subscribers, and placed him on permanent display. The city was fascinated. Marshall was captivated. Egyptology in the 1820s and 1830s was not merely an academic pursuit. It was a cultural fever. Napoleon's campaigns had opened the ancient world to European eyes. The temples of the Nile, the hieroglyphs, the colossal statuary, all of it spoke of a civilization that had mastered permanence. Marshall, a man who had built his fortune on a plant that grew in shallow soil and required constant human attention, found in Egypt something that linen alone could not provide, the sensation of eternity. But his interest was not purely aesthetic. Marshall had done his research. He knew that the ancient Egyptians had cultivated and processed flax along the banks of the Nile for thousands of years, that linen had clothed their priests, wrapped their dead, and furnished their temples. When he commissioned a new factory in the mid-1830s, he did not want it to look like a mill. He wanted it to look like the source. He wanted to suggest, in stone and mortar, that what was happening on Marshall Street in Holbeck was the direct continuation of the greatest textile civilization the world had ever known. To realize this vision, he assembled an unusual team. Joseph Bonomi the Younger, an architect and Egyptologist who had spent years drawing the temples of the Upper Nile, was brought in to direct the design. The painter David Roberts, who would later produce the defining series of lithographs of ancient Egypt, was also engaged. Roberts did not merely sketch from memory. He traveled to the Temple of Karnak specifically to study its proportions and its relationship to light before a single stone was laid on Marshall Street. This was not decoration. This was archaeology applied to industry. Yet for all his grandeur of vision, Marshall was not entirely a romantic. He was a manufacturer, and he understood the dangers of his trade with uncommon clarity. Textile mills burned. They burned because the raw fibers were flammable, because the machinery ran hot, because the buildings were tall and the staircases became chimneys when fire took hold. Marshall had seen it happen to his competitors. He was determined it would not happen to him. He specified 25 fire escapes in the new building. He made it single-story, an almost revolutionary decision for a factory of this scale in an era when height was equated with capacity. He built a school adjacent to the site for the children of his workers. He arranged for a doctor to be available. He believed, or at least told himself, that a workforce that was educated and cared for was a workforce that would not break down. Whether this was philanthropy or calculation is a question the historical record does not settle cleanly. Probably it was both, in proportions that shifted depending on the year and the quarter's profits. What is not in dispute is the scale of what Marshall had in mind. By 1836, when construction of Temple Works began in earnest, he already owned 3 mills in Holbeck. The new complex was intended to be larger than all of them combined. A statement addressed not to his competitors, but to history itself. He was 63 years old when the foundations were laid. He had spent 45 years building an empire out of a plant that broke if you pulled it too hard. Now he was going to build a temple. What he had not yet decided, what perhaps he never fully resolved, was who the temple was for. The office building came first, and it announced itself without apology. Facing Marshall Street, the facade rose in pale ashlar stone. 18 full-height windows separated by 18 columns, each carved with the battered profile and overhanging cornice of the ancient Egyptian style. The proportions were drawn directly from 2 temples on the Upper Nile, the temple at Antiopolis and the great temple of Horus at Edfu. Above the roofline, a chimney climbed into the Leeds sky in the form of an obelisk. To anyone approaching along Marshall Street from the direction of the canal, the effect was startling and deliberately so. This was not a building that asked to be mistaken for anything other than what it claimed to be, a monument. But the office building was only the overture. Behind it, connected and yet distinct, stood the mill itself, modeled on the Typhonium at Dendera, one of the best-preserved temple complexes on the Nile. Where the office block spoke of authority and presentation, the mill spoke of something older and stranger, a vast, low, horizontal mass of brick, stretching back from the street with the quiet assurance of a structure that expected to outlast everyone who entered it, which, as it happened, it very nearly has. Inside, the engineering was as remarkable as the architecture. The mill floor was single-story, an almost unprecedented decision for a factory of this capacity, and it was covered by a system of brick vaulting supported on cast-iron columns through which 65 conical skylights opened to the sky above. The effect on the interior was one of diffused, even light, distributed across the floor, without the harsh shadows that afflicted multi-story mills. The building breathed through its ceiling. The light fell softly, and the space it illuminated was, at the time of its completion, the largest single room in the world. This was not a casual claim. It was a verifiable fact, and it was known as such. Visitors came from across Britain and from the continent to stand inside and look from one end to the other and find that the far wall was almost too distant to read clearly. Engineers came to study the vaulting. Architects came to understand the skylights. And journalists came to write about the sheep. The sheep require explanation. Flax, unlike cotton or wool, is acutely sensitive to atmospheric conditions. If the air in a spinning mill falls below a certain humidity, the fibers dry out, become brittle, and snap. Broken thread means stopped machines. Stopped machines mean lost production. Marshall's engineers had solved this problem with characteristic ingenuity. The roof of the mill was covered in a layer of soil, across which grass was sown and maintained. The grass absorbed moisture from the air and released it downward, while the soil provided insulation against temperature fluctuation. The result was a controlled internal climate, stable at approximately 26 degrees Celsius throughout the year, warm and damp as a greenhouse, entirely hostile to the breaking of linen thread. The grass naturally required cutting, And here the engineering met its limit, not technical, but biological. Sheep cannot climb stairs. The solution was the hydraulic lift, a platform mechanism powered by water pressure, capable of raising livestock from ground level to the rooftop and returning them safely to the yard below. It was one of the first hydraulic lifts ever constructed, and it was built not for human convenience, but for the management of grazing animals on the roof of a factory in West Yorkshire. Benjamin Hick, the hydraulics engineer who supplied the mill's 240 horsepower double beam engine, is the most likely candidate for its invention, though the historical record leaves the question open. His youngest son, William, supervised the installation of the engine during 1841, the year after the building opened. The mill began production in the second half of 1840, 6 months after the grand opening in June of that year. The opening itself had been marked by a temperance tea for the firm's 2,600 workers, a celebration from which alcohol was entirely absent, on Marshall's express instruction. It was a gesture that told you something about the man, generous enough to feed his workforce, controlling enough to decide what they drank. By the time the machinery was fully installed and running, Temple Works was operating at a scale that had no equal in the British linen industry. The 240 horsepower engine drove spindles that ran continuously, fed by hands that worked in conditions of engineered warmth and humidity, beneath a ceiling of brick vaulting and diffused light, in a room that the newspapers of the day struggled to describe without resorting to the language of the sublime. It was by any measure an extraordinary achievement. It was also by any honest measure only half of what Marshall had originally envisioned. The new complex extended only as far as the existing site permitted. It did not reach Sweet Street as planned. It contained half the spindles that the full design would have housed. No cloth was ever woven there, as had been intended, because the demand for finished linen products had slumped by the time the building was complete. The largest room in the world had been built at precisely the moment the world began to want something else. That tension between the scale of the ambition and the limits of what the market would bear would define everything that followed. By the early 1840s, John Marshall was the largest producer of linen in England. That sentence bears repeating because its implications were not merely commercial. To be the largest producer of linen in England in the 1840s was to sit at the center of an industry that clothed soldiers, rigged ships, and furnished the households of a nation that was, at that precise moment, the wealthiest on earth. Marshall's 4 mills in Holbeck, designated Mills B through E, Mill A having been demolished in 1837, operated as a single integrated system, with the different stages of production distributed across the complex according to the requirements of each process. The coarsest and dirtiest work, the heckling, the combing of raw flax to separate the long fibers from the short, was carried out in a separate building, away from the spinning floors, where the dust it generated could be contained. The wet spinning itself and the winding of the finished thread onto bobbins took place at Temple Works, in the carefully controlled atmosphere that the grass roof and the skylights maintained. The output was prodigious. At its peak, the Marshall operation employed 2,000 workers across the Holbeck complex, running machinery that ran without pause from the opening bell to the closing one. Buyers came from across Britain. Agents placed orders on behalf of clients in Europe and the Americas. The Marshall name, in the linen trade of the 1840s, carried the same weight that a great banking house might carry in the city of London, a guarantee of scale, consistency, and permanence. Visitors came too, though not always as buyers. Temple Works had acquired, almost immediately upon its completion, the status of an industrial spectacle. Engineers arrived to study the vaulting system and the skylights. Architects came to examine the facade and argue about the accuracy of the Egyptian detailing. Journalists from the London papers made the journey north and filed reports that oscillated between admiration and bewilderment. How was it possible, they asked, that a building which looked like a temple on the banks of the Nile was producing linen thread in the back streets of Leeds? The question was rhetorical, but it was also, in its way, the right one. Marshall understood the value of being looked at. He had built something that could not be ignored, and he made no effort to discourage the attention it attracted. Temple Works was a manufacturer's argument. made in stone and engineering, that industry and civilization were not in opposition, that a factory could be in its own right a work of culture. To reinforce this argument, he invested in the community that surrounded the mill with a consistency that distinguished him from most of his contemporaries. A school was established adjacent to the site, providing basic education for the children of his workers. Children who, until the age of 12, were housed in dormitories in the undercroft of the complex while their parents worked the floors above. A doctor was retained, a company shop operated within the building, and between 1847 and 1850 a church, St. John the Evangelist, designed in the Gothic style by George Gilbert Scott, who would later restore the nave of Westminster Abbey, was constructed directly behind Temple Mill, as if to consecrate the ground on which the empire stood. From the outside then, and from a certain distance, the picture was coherent and even impressive. A great industrialist who had built not just a factory, but a small civic world around it, who addressed his enterprise in the language of ancient grandeur, and who employed 2,000 of his fellow citizens in conditions that were, by the standards of the age, not the worst imaginable. From the outside, at a certain distance, Holbeck itself told a different story. The district that surrounded the Marshall complex was, by the 1840s, one of the most densely populated and polluted neighborhoods in a city that was itself one of the most polluted in Britain. The expansion of the textile industry had drawn tens of thousands of workers into an area whose infrastructure had been built for a fraction of that number. The air carried the smell of dye and coal smoke. The streets between the mills were narrow and unlit. The wealthier residents of Leeds, the merchants, the lawyers, the mill owners themselves, had long since removed themselves to the cleaner elevations of Chapel Allerton and Potter Newton, where the prevailing winds did not carry the output of the factories they owned. The workers stayed. They stayed because they had no choice, and because the wage, however modest, was the only wage available. They stayed in courts and back-to-backs, within walking distance of the factory gates. They stayed, and they worked, and they breathed the air that the machinery in the city between them produced. That was the view from inside the gates. And inside the gates, the story was not about the facade. She does not appear in the ledgers by name. This is not an oversight. It is simply how the records were kept. The Marshall firm's accounts noted wages paid, thread produced, machinery maintained. The individual hands that fed the flax into the frames, that monitored the bobbins, that stood for 12 hours in air that was kept warm and damp by engineering, rather than by any concern for their comfort. Those hands were not considered worth recording individually. They were a collective fact, like the weather or the water in the canal. They were there. They worked. They were replaced when they could no longer continue. She was young. Most of the workers on the spinning floors were. In the early 1840s, the average life expectancy of a factory worker in Leeds was 19 years. Not 19 years of working life, 19 years of life in total. The figure sits in the historical record with the quiet devastation of a number that refuses to be argued with. For the merchant class of the same city, the average was 44. The distance between those two numbers, 25 years, was the distance between Marshall Street and Chapel Allerton. It was the distance between the inside of the temple and the outside of it. Inside, the conditions were specific and unrelenting. The humidity that preserved the linen thread did not distinguish between fiber and lung. The air in the mill was permanently warm and saturated, necessary for the spinning process, deeply hostile to the respiratory systems of the people who breathed it for 12 hours at a stretch, 6 days a week. Flax dust accumulated. It settled in the throat and the chest with a patience that outlasted the working day, outlasted the walk home through the Holbeck courts, outlasted sleep. The disease it caused did not announce itself quickly. It arrived gradually, over months and years, as a tightening, a shortness, a cough that did not resolve. The noise was constant. The frames ran without pause from the opening of the gates to the closing bell, and the sound they produced. A rhythmic, mechanical thunder that filled the largest room in the world from one end to the other was not something that could be ignored or habituated to, only endured. Workers communicated by gesture and by lip reading. Conversation, in any meaningful sense, was impossible during the working day. She stood beneath one of the 65 skylights. This is not a detail invented for effect. It is a structural fact that every worker on the floor stood beneath a skylight because the skylights were distributed across the entire ceiling in a regular grid, and the floor below them was where the frames were positioned. The light that fell through the glass above her head had been engineered to maintain a particular temperature. It was not there for her. It was there for the thread. This distinction between what was designed for the process and what incidentally affected the person is the one that the building's admirers rarely pause to consider. The skylights were celebrated in the architectural press. The humidity system was praised in the engineering journals. The sheep on the roof became a popular curiosity. Nobody wrote at length in the publications that covered temple works with such enthusiasm about what it was to stand in that carefully calibrated atmosphere for 12 hours and then walk out into the cold of a Holbeck evening. The Leeds Mercury did, once. In 1842, following the events that would come to a head that August, the paper published an article that set the daily reality of a worker's life against the recorded expenditures of the Marshall family. The carriages, the country properties, the donations to learned societies. The contrast was not subtle, and it was not intended to be. The paper did not name individual workers. It described a condition, a structural fact as solid and as unmovable as the Egyptian columns on Marshall Street. Outside the gates, the condition extended into every corner of Holbeck. The district had been built for a population a fraction of its current size. By the 1840s, it held tens of thousands of people in streets that had not been designed for them, in housing that had not been built to last, breathing air that the combined output of the mills and the domestic coal fires had turned the color of a persistent bruise. The families who could afford to leave had left, to Chapel Allerton, to Potter Newton, to the higher ground where the wind came in clean from the west. The families who could not afford to leave stayed and sent their children to the school beside the mill, and were grateful in the complicated way that people are grateful when gratitude is the only option available to them. She was one of them. She worked in the largest room in the world and occupied, within it, a space roughly the width of her shoulders and the length of her reach. She fed flax into a frame that was worth more than she would earn in a decade. She breathed the air that was kept moist for the benefit of the thread. She stood beneath a skylight that was there for the temperature. She does not appear in the ledgers by name, but the thread that left Temple Works, the thread that was wound onto bobbins and packed into crates and shipped to buyers across Britain and Europe, was pulled into existence by hands like hers. The empire was built on those hands. The temple was paid for by what those hands produced. John Marshall understood legacy. He built in stone, in the style of a civilization that had lasted 3,000 years. He did not build a monument to her. The summer of 1842 was the angriest summer Britain had seen in a generation. It had been building for years. A decade of industrial expansion had produced wealth on a scale that would have been unimaginable to the previous century, and had distributed it with a narrowness that was becoming impossible to defend. Wages had been cut repeatedly across the textile districts of the North. The Corn Laws kept the price of bread artificially high. The new Poor Law, introduced in 1834, had stripped away the parish-based safety nets that had cushioned the working poor through previous downturns and replaced them with the workhouse. A deliberate humiliation designed to make destitution so unpleasant that any wage, however inadequate, would seem preferable. For hundreds of thousands of working people across Lancashire and Yorkshire, it was not. In August, they stopped the mills. The method was simple and effective. Workers moved from factory to factory in organized groups, removing the plugs from the boilers, the small metal stoppers that allowed steam pressure to build, and drawing them out so that no fire could be lit and no engine could run. The plugs fell into buckets. The boilers went cold. The machines stopped. The action spread from mill to mill across the textile districts with a speed that alarmed the mill owners, the magistrates, and the government in equal measure. It was not, strictly speaking, a revolution, but it was, without question, the largest industrial stoppage Britain had ever witnessed. Historians would later call it the first general strike. It reached Holbeck on a morning in August. The Leeds Annals recorded what happened outside Temple Works with the compressed urgency of a report written by someone who had been present and was still unsettled by what he had seen. The vicinity of the new mill on Marshall Street, he wrote, was completely crammed with an excited mob, many of whom were armed with bludgeons and stones. The crowd pressed against the gates. They were not, in the main, strangers. They were neighbors, many of them former mill workers themselves, or the family members of those who worked inside. The building that faced them across the gates was the largest factory in Leeds, dressed in the architecture of an ancient empire. The gap between what the building represented and what the people outside it were experiencing had, on that morning, become intolerable. The Marshall firm's response was managed by Richardson, the works manager, who closed all 4 mills the following day. The decision was made quickly, before any damage was done, a calculation rather than a concession. Within the family, the response was less measured. Stephen Marshall, a member of the 3rd generation, who had entered the business alongside his father James and his uncles, traced the unrest directly to Temple Mill. In the internal correspondence that followed, he described the workforce there as, in his own words, as bad a lot of men as we have. His proposed remedy was striking in its vindictiveness. The public dismissal of the foreman at Temple Mill, carried out in such a manner as to ruin him, to make an example visible enough to discourage any future organization. Other members of the family persuaded him to step back from this course of action, at least initially. The mills were reopened. Negotiations began. They dragged on for days while the Leeds Mercury published its account of the disparity between the conditions of the workers and the circumstances of the family that employed them. In the end, a 10% wage increase was conceded, extracted by the withdrawal of labor in a way that no petition or appeal had ever managed to achieve. It was a victory of a kind and a limited one. The family accepted the outcome at a meeting and then, in the same meeting, resolved to address the troublemakers at Temple Mill over the longer term. The word used in the record is deal with. It is not a phrase that invites generous interpretation. Stephen Marshall was 29 years old in 1842. He had not built Temple Works. He had not commissioned the Egyptian facade or negotiated with Joseph Bonomi over the proportions of the columns or stood on the roof in the early morning watching the sheep graze above the skylights. He had inherited all of that: the building, the business, the name, and the complications that came with all three. His instinct, when confronted with organized dissent, was not to examine the conditions that had produced it, but to identify the individuals responsible and remove them. It is worth noting that he was not unusual in this. It is also worth noting that the man who had built the temple, John Marshall, who had specified the fire escapes and funded the school and brought a doctor onto the site, had also built a system in which a 10% wage concession required a general strike to obtain. The crowd dispersed. The boilers were relit. The frames began to turn again, and the thread resumed its passage from flax to bobbin, to crate to ship. The building on Marshall Street showed no visible mark of what had happened outside its gates. But something had shifted, not in the stone, not in the machinery, not in the carefully maintained atmosphere of the spinning floor. In the relationship between the temple and the people who kept it running, a crack had opened that no amount of negotiation would fully close. The empire would continue for another 4 decades. It would spend most of them losing money. The closing of Temple Works did not happen on a single day. That is the first thing to understand about the end of the Marshall Empire, that it was not a collapse in the dramatic sense, not a sudden failure of machinery, or a catastrophic loss, not a fire or a flood or a bankruptcy filed in panic on a Tuesday morning. It was something slower and, in its way, more difficult to witness. A gradual diminishment spread across 4 decades in which each year was slightly worse than the one before it, and the gap between what the business had been and what it was becoming widened with the unhurried patience of a tide going out. The causes were structural, and they had been visible since the early 1840s. Free trade in textile machinery, the policy that Britain had championed as a principle of economic liberalism, had transferred the technology of wet spinning to competitors in Ireland, France, and Belgium, where labor costs were lower and the raw material closer to hand. Irish linen, in particular, undercut the Leeds product on price, with a consistency that no amount of operational efficiency at Temple Works could overcome. The Marshall firm had anticipated a slump in the 1840s and expected recovery. The recovery did not come. What came instead was a new permanent reality in which the economics of English flax spinning simply did not work. The numbers told a story without mercy. In the final 40 years of the Marshall firm's existence, it recorded a loss in 21 of them, more than half. A business that had once set the terms of an entire industry was now, for the majority of its remaining life, a net subtraction from the family's wealth, sustained not by its profitability, but by its momentum, its reputation, and the unwillingness of the men who ran it to be the ones who admitted that it was finished. Stephen Marshall was among those men. He had entered the business in the 1830s as a young man in the shadow of a father and a grandfather whose achievements were already being celebrated in the architectural and engineering press. He had managed the plug riots of 1842 with a firmness that shaded into vindictiveness. He had watched the profit margins narrow through the 1850s, stabilize briefly in the 1860s, and then begin their long, final decline in the 1870s. By that decade, the Leeds flax industry as a whole was contracting. Mills were closing across Holbeck, workforces were being reduced, and the trade press that had once marveled at the scale of English linen production was now writing its quiet obituaries. And yet Temple Works kept running. It kept running because Stephen Marshall understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has inherited rather than built, that to close Temple Works was not merely a business decision. It was a statement about the family, about the city, about the meaning of the building that his grandfather had dressed in the architecture of eternity. The Egyptian columns on Marshall Street had been designed to suggest permanence. To lower the gates and send the workforce home was to admit that the permanence had been, from the beginning, a performance. He was not ready to make that admission. Not in the 1860s, not in the 1870s. Perhaps not ever entirely. But by the early 1880s, the choice had ceased to be his to make. The firm was losing money with a regularity that no restructuring could address, and the market for English linen had contracted to a point where no volume of production at Temple Works could generate a margin worth defending. The building on Marshall Street, the largest room in the world, the temple to a 3,000-year-old civilization of linen, was running at a loss. And Stephen Marshall, who had spent 40 years inside its shadow, was finally running out of arguments for keeping it open. In 1886, the Marshall firm ceased production at Temple Works. The company did not dissolve immediately. It reorganized, restructured, and eventually relocated its remaining operations across the Atlantic to America, where the economics of linen manufacturing had not yet been exhausted. It was a rational decision made by rational men. It was also an acknowledgement, stated in the plainest possible commercial language, that the enterprise John Marshall had built in Holbeck, the enterprise he had dressed in stone columns and Egyptian cornices, and the ambition of a man who wanted to be remembered alongside the pharaohs, was finished in England. Stephen Marshall was in his early 70s by then. He had spent more than 4 decades inside the business, and more than half of those decades watching it lose money. He had negotiated with workers and with buyers, with creditors and with competitors. He had outlasted most of the men who had started alongside him, and now he stood, or we may imagine him standing, because the historical record does not preserve the precise circumstances of his final day at the mill, at the end of something that had begun before he was born and that he had not been able to save. The machine stopped. Not all at once. A mill does not fall silent the way a conversation does, in a single moment of shared understanding. It stops gradually, station by station, frame by frame, as the drive shafts are disengaged and the bobbins run out and are not replaced, and the belts slacken and the rhythm that has defined the building for 46 years slows and stutters and finally ceases. The last sound would have been the settling of the machinery, the metallic cooling, the creak of components releasing tension. And then, for the first time since June of 1840, something approaching silence in the largest room in the world. The 65 skylights went on delivering light. They did not know the difference. 2,000 workers, or what remained of the workforce by 1886, diminished by years of contraction, were discharged from the payroll. Holbeck, which had grown around the Marshall complex like a city growing around a cathedral, absorbed the loss in the way that industrial districts absorb such losses. Slowly, incompletely, with a damage that does not show immediately, but accumulates in the empty mornings and the closed shops and the children who grow up in a neighborhood whose reason for existing has quietly departed. The grass on the roof was no longer maintained. The sheep, long since removed as the building's commercial life contracted, did not return. The hydraulic lift that had been invented to carry them to the rooftop stood idle. The obelisk chimney had already been demolished in 1852, after a crack appeared in its structure, and replaced with a conventional brick stack, a first small concession to practicality over symbolism that, in retrospect, had been an early signal of what was coming. What was left was the building itself. It stood on Marshall Street with the indifference of very old stone, the same indifference with which the temples on the Nile had stood through the rise and fall of the civilizations that came after the ones that built them. It had been designed to look permanent. It had turned out, against all commercial probability, to actually be permanent. Not because anyone continued to need it, but because no one could quite bring themselves to pull it down, and because the cost of demolishing 240,000 square feet of brick vaulting was, if anything, higher than the cost of leaving it alone. Stephen Marshall had spent his life in the shadow of something his grandfather had built. Now the shadow remained, and the purpose it had cast shade over was gone. He had not built the temple. He had not saved it. He had simply been the last one left inside it when the machinery stopped. The inheritor of a vision he had not chosen, the custodian of a monument he had not designed, and, in the end, the man who turned off the lights. The empire was over. The temple was not. A building that has lost its purpose does not disappear. It waits. Temple works waited with the particular patience of a structure that had been built to last centuries and had not been given a convincing reason to doubt its own longevity. The Egyptian columns on Marshall Street continued to face the street. The brick vaulting continued to hold. The 65 skylights continued to admit the Yorkshire light, falling now onto empty floors rather than spinning frames, illuminating nothing in particular with the same careful geometry they had maintained since 1840. The first to take on the building after the Marshalls were James Rhodes, a clothing manufacturer, who acquired the complex in the years following the 1886 closure, and set his workers to producing garments in a space that had been designed for the spinning of linen thread. The scale of the building dwarfed the new operation, as it had dwarfed nothing under the Marshalls. 1,000 people at the spinning frames had filled the floor with noise and motion and the sense of a room being used to its capacity. Rhodes's cutters and machinists occupied the same space with a different density, and the building wore its new purpose with the mild tolerance of something that knows it is being underused. Rhodes was followed by other tenants, other trades, other purposes that the historical record preserves only in outline. A box factory occupied part of the site at some point in the early 20th century. The details are sparse. The building endured them all. Then in 1953, Temple Works became a warehouse. The Kay's Mail Order Company, one of the largest catalog retailers in Britain, having absorbed the local firm of Samuel Driver, took over the complex and converted it into a distribution center for the parcels and packages that its customers ordered by post from catalogs the size of small encyclopedias. It was, in terms of the building's original ambitions, a diminishment so complete as to be almost comic. The largest room in the world, modeled on the temples of the Nile, filled with cardboard boxes destined for the living rooms of Middle England. And yet the building, as it always had, made something of its circumstances. In 1968, the poet and architectural critic John Betjeman came to Leeds to make a film for the BBC. John Betjeman Discovers Leeds, in which he wandered the city's Victorian streetscapes with the affectionate indignation of a man who could see beauty that his contemporaries had decided was merely old. He found Temple Works on Marshall Street, still operating as the Kay's warehouse, still staffed by workers who moved between the Egyptian columns on their way to and from their shifts. And he stood before the facade and said what very few people in Leeds were saying at the time, that this was a building of extraordinary importance, that it deserved to be understood rather than merely used. and that the city was fortunate, luckier than it knew, to still have it standing. Leeds in 1968 was not especially interested in Betjeman's opinion. The city was in the midst of a comprehensive redevelopment program that had already demolished significant portions of its Victorian fabric and showed no signs of slowing. The Temple Works facade attracted no official protection at that point. It simply continued to exist, behind the K's signage, while the city changed around it. The workers who passed through its gates in those years were photographed in the 1970s by Peter Mitchell, a Leeds-based photographer whose work documented the city's working-class neighborhoods with a precision and humanity that would later be recognized as one of the significant photographic records of post-war British urban life. His images of K's night shift workers outside Temple Works, caught in the particular light of a Yorkshire winter morning at the end of a shift, before the walk home, are among the few visual documents that record the human life of the building in its later decades. They are not celebrated images of an industrial monument. They are photographs of tired people at the end of a long night, with an Egyptian temple behind them that none of them had asked to work inside. In 1981, K's closed the Holbeck operation and relocated to a purpose-built warehouse on Sweet Street. The move was rational. The new building was purpose-designed for modern distribution logistics, with loading bays and vehicle access that Marshall Street could not provide. Temple Works once again was left without a tenant. What followed was the period that the building's admirers and its critics would later argue about most fiercely. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the complex was used intermittently for cultural events, music performances, art installations, temporary exhibitions that drew on the building's atmosphere of vast, deteriorating grandeur. The empty mill floor, with its columns and its vaulting and its broken skylights, admitting weather as freely as they had once admitted controlled light, became a space that artists and promoters found irresistible precisely because it had ceased to be managed. The decay was part of the appeal. The building was most itself, some argued, when it was most ruined. By the early years of the 21st century, sections of the roof had collapsed. Vegetation had established itself in the upper reaches of the vaulting. The grass that had once been maintained by engineering and grazed by sheep had given way to something wilder and less purposeful. Buddleia in the gutters, moss on the stone, the slow, patient work of weather on a structure that had not been properly maintained in decades. The largest room in the world was open to the sky, not as it had been designed to be, controlled, calibrated, purposeful, but in the way that ruins are open to the sky, without permission, without plan, and with a beauty that no architect had intended and no engineer had calculated. Each life the building had lived had left a layer. The linen, the clothing, the catalogs, the concerts, the collapse, stacked one upon another like the strata of a geological record. They did not add up to a coherent story. They added up to a building that had survived everything that had happened to it without anyone quite deciding that it should. That, in itself, was becoming a kind of answer, though to what question exactly remained to be seen. In 2017, Temple Works was put up for auction with a starting price of £1 sterling. The figure was not a gesture of generosity, it was a statement of liability. To own Temple Works in 2017 was to own a Grade 1 listed building, the only one in Holbeck, with a collapsed roof, deteriorating vaulting, and a restoration estimate that would later be placed at £35 million. The listing that protected the building from demolition also prevented any owner from altering it significantly without consent, which meant that the Egyptian columns and the brick vaulting and the 65 skylights, or what remained of them, would need to be preserved, restored, and maintained by whoever took on the title deeds. The £1 starting price was the market's honest assessment of what that responsibility was worth to a private buyer in a post-industrial neighborhood of Leeds. A developer named CEG acquired the building and began the slow work of establishing what a viable future for the site might look like. In June 2019, the company published an estimate of £35 million for the restoration works, a figure that made clear, if it had not already been clear, that Temple Works was not a problem that private capital alone could solve. The building required public money, public ambition, and public patience in quantities that the commercial property market was structurally incapable of providing. The public money began to arrive in 2020. In March of that year, it was announced that Temple Works was under consideration as the site for a proposed northern branch of the British Library, an institution that had, since its opening in London in 1998, been among the most visited public buildings in the country, and whose collections included materials of direct relevance to the industrial and social history of the north of England. The government's budget that year promised £25 million towards the restoration of the building to enable this use. It was the largest single financial commitment the site had attracted in its entire post-industrial existence, and it reframed the question that Temple Works had been asking since 1886. Not whether the building could be saved, but what saving it was actually for. The Culture Recovery Fund, administered in partnership with Historic England, subsequently made available more than £1 million for immediate repair work, stabilization of the most vulnerable sections of the roof, emergency consolidation of the vaulting, the basic structural interventions without which no larger project could proceed. Historic England, in the report that accompanied this funding, noted that there were more than 230 vacant and underused mills in Yorkshire alone. Temple Works was one of them. It was, however, the only one that had been built to look like a temple on the banks of the Nile. And this distinction, which might have seemed, in purely practical terms, irrelevant to the question of structural stabilization, turned out to matter enormously in the competition for public attention and public funding. The question that no one asked aloud, but that the funding history made difficult to avoid, was this: if the building on Marshall Street had looked like every other Victorian mill in Holbeck, if John Marshall had built in the functional brick vernacular of his competitors rather than commissioning Joseph Bonomi to model his factory on the Typhonium at Dendera, would anyone be spending £35 million to save it? In February 2025, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government confirmed an additional £10 million of funding for Homes England to bring Temple Works into public ownership, with a view to establishing the viability of a permanent British library presence at the site. The language of the announcement was careful and conditional, with a view to establishing the viability, which is the language of institutions that have learned from long experience not to promise more than the planning process will allow. But the direction of travel was clear. After nearly a century and a half of commercial tenants, cultural squatters, partial collapses, and £1 auction prices, Temple Works was on the verge of becoming, for the first time since John Marshall built it, a building with a publicly stated purpose. Whether that purpose would be realized and on what timescale and in what form remained at the time of writing genuinely uncertain. The £35 million required for full restoration had not been fully committed. The British Library's presence in the building remained a proposal rather than a plan. The roof over the mill floor, the roof that had once carried grass and sheep and the weight of an empire's ambitions, was still in significant portions open to the sky. And yet something had changed that the £1 auction price of 2017 had not anticipated. The building was no longer simply waiting. It had acquired, for the first time in decades, advocates, institutions with budgets and briefs, and the particular determination of organizations that have decided, publicly and on the record, that a thing is worth saving. John Marshall had built Temple Works to last. He had built it in the style of civilizations that measured their permanence in millennia rather than decades. He had not, so far as the historical record suggests, considered the possibility that his building might outlast his empire by a century and a half and still be arguing, in the 21st century, for the right to be used. But then he had not anticipated the £1 auction price either. Some things even the most carefully designed monuments cannot predict. On a morning in early spring, the light comes through the skylights at Temple Works the way it always has. Not all 65 of them are intact. Some are open to the weather now, their glass long since gone, their frames rusted to the color of old machinery. But the ones that remain do what they were designed to do in 1840. They take the Yorkshire light, which is not the light of the Nile, which is grayer and more conditional and arrives at a lower angle, and they distribute it across the mill floor in overlapping circles, softening the shadows between the cast iron columns, falling on brick and stone, and the accumulated silence of a room that has not held a working machine in nearly 140 years. The light does not know this. It falls anyway. 3 people passed through this building, and none of them are here now. The first was the man who built it. John Marshall spent 45 years constructing an empire from a plant that broke if you handled it carelessly, and then he spent the last years of his life constructing a monument that he believed would outlast the empire, that would place him in the estimation of history alongside the civilizations that had first discovered what flax could do. He was not entirely wrong. The building is still standing, his name is still attached to it. But the pharaohs he admired did not build their temples to house machinery, and the distance between what Marshall intended and what temple works actually was, a factory employing 2,000 people in conditions of engineered humidity for the production of linen thread, is a distance that the Egyptian columns on Marshall Street were designed to make invisible. He died in 1845, 5 years after the opening, before the long decline had fully declared itself. He did not see the red ink of the final 4 decades. He did not see the gates close. He left behind a building that was, at the moment of his death, still the largest room in the world, still producing linen at a scale without equal in England, still capable of sustaining the belief that what he had built was permanent. Some men are fortunate in their timing. Marshall was one of them. The second person was the young woman who stood beneath a skylight on the spinning floor in 1842, whose name does not appear in any ledger that has survived, and whose presence in the historical record consists entirely of what can be inferred from the conditions in which she worked. The humidity that preserved the thread, the dust that accumulated in the lungs, the light that fell through the glass above her head, engineered for temperature rather than for her. She was 19 years old, or thereabouts. The average age at which a factory worker in Leeds in the 1840s could expect to have exhausted the statistical probability of continued survival. Whether she reached 20 or 30 or beyond is not recorded. She was there. She worked. She fed flax into a frame in the largest room in the world and produced thread that was wound onto bobbins and packed into crates and sent to buyers whose names are preserved in the Marshall firm's correspondence with the same care that hers was not. She is the one the building does not commemorate. She is also, in any honest accounting, the one without whom the building could not have existed. The third was Stephen Marshall, who inherited an empire he had not built, managed a crisis he had not caused, and closed a factory he had not been able to save. He was the last of his line to stand inside Temple Works with the authority of ownership. And when the machine stopped in 1886, he walked out of a building that continued to stand after every other element of the enterprise: the profit, the workforce, the purpose, the family's connection to the site, had gone. He had spent 40 years trying to be adequate to a vision that was not his. He had failed in the way that all inheritors of extraordinary things eventually fail, not through weakness, but through the simple impossibility of sustaining, across generations, the specific conditions that made the extraordinary thing possible in the first place. If you were to put sheep on the roof of Temple Works today, they would find grass. It has grown back, untended, unmanaged, the voluntary return of something that was once an engineering solution and is now simply nature reasserting itself in the absence of human intention. The hydraulic lift is gone. The obelisk chimney was demolished in 1852. The 240 horsepower engine that Benjamin Hick installed in 1841 was removed long ago, its components dispersed or melted down or simply lost to the record. What remains is the building, the columns, the vaulting, the skylights, whole and broken, admitting the light in whatever quantity the Yorkshire morning is willing to provide. John Marshall built Temple Works to ask a question about greatness, about whether a factory could be a temple, whether industry could be a civilization, whether what was happening on Marshall Street in Holbeck was continuous with the 3,000-year tradition of linen that had clothed the priests of ancient Egypt. He dressed the question in stone and commissioned the best architects available to make it look like an answer. The building is still standing. The question is still open. Was it a temple? Was it a factory? Was it a monument to vision, or a monument to the distance between vision and the people required to make it real? The light through the skylights does not answer. It falls on the empty floor with the same even distribution it has maintained since 1840. Impartial, geometric, unchanged by everything that has happened beneath it. It was designed to maintain a temperature. It was designed to serve a process. It was not designed to mean anything. And yet here it is, still falling long after the thread is gone, and the machines are gone, and the hands that fed the flax are gone, and the empire is gone, and the man who believed he was building eternity has been in the ground for 180 years. Light needs no purpose to persist. Perhaps that is the only answer Temple Works has ever been willing to give.